Has demonic possession ever been pled in legal cases? So let's say I murder someone and I say, the devil made me do it. Is that a legal defense? If I'm possessed by the devil, it could be a red herring. It could be like, okay, well, you could be possessed, but ultimately, do you believe you committed it? If you're not guilty, you're not guilty.
Right.
Whether or not the client wants to plead demonic possession in his testimony and trial, that's his doing, right? Mm-hmm. But you shouldn't, because of demonic possession, sidetrack and say, okay, actually, let's just plead guilty because that's going to help
the client.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Hi, welcome to Dangerous Person 2.0, the English channel. I'm Jean.
I'm Rosie.
And we're doing a different format today. So as my sister did the other case, our format is each of us do not know what cases we're speaking about. So we're listening for the first time. So my case, my sister has never heard of it. So she's going to ask me questions and kind of engage in a discussion. And just a little background, I'm an attorney in the United States. And my sister also read law at university.
But I'm a housewife now. No shame in that.
For now, she's a housewife. Perhaps we might get back into the legal field. I don't know. And with that said, my two loves in life is all things horror and the law. So one day it got me thinking, has demonic possession ever been pled in legal cases? So let's say I murder someone and I say, the devil made me do it. Is that a legal defense? Well, we're going to find out. So in America, the first well-known case where demonic possession was first pled or attempted to be pled was the case of Arne Cheyenne Johnson. And let me give you a background of the case. So on February 16th, 1981, Arne Cheyenne Johnson woke up, 19 years old, had a sore throat, chest congestion, and he had an upset stomach and a headache. So naturally, he called in sick to work. So he worked as a tree surgeon at Wright Tree Services.
At 19?
Yes.
As a tree surgeon.
So a bit of a background about Arne Johnson. He dropped out of high school, but he still insisted to keep a job to support his family.
Yeah.
His mom and his sisters, essentially. So at 19, he was working as a tree surgeon. And despite the name surgeon, essentially a tree surgeon is, and I'm not sure if you're aware, is people who repair, maintain, and kind of take care of trees.
It's pretty,
it's a tough job.
It's a tough job, but you get a lot of money out of that
too.
Apparently.
Right? Yeah, so at 19,
yeah, 19, that's why I was like, tree surgeon, 19. He's
right, quite impressive for 19.
Some money there.
Yes. So Arne Johnson called in sick, but that day he still decided to go visit his girlfriend, Debbie Glatzel, who was 27 at the time. So himself, his sisters, Janice and Wanda Johnson, and their cousin Mary decided to go visit Debbie Glatzel. And at the time, Debbie Glatzel was a professional dog groomer and was working at the Brookfield boarding kennels to look after dogs. So at that time, the kennel was managed by an Alan Bono, who was 40 at the time. Alan Bono was described as someone quite interesting, had a completely different life to Arne Johnson and also to Debbie Glatzel, who were essentially, they were born and raised in a small town in Connecticut, didn't really venture out of Connecticut, didn't really have an exciting life, whereas Alan Bono lived in Australia, was in Florida prior to coming to Brookfield, Connecticut, where this situation happened. And Alan Bono was the manager, and his sister actually owned the kennel. So his sister basically called him in Florida and said, hello, well, I have a kennel. I would like for you to manage our kennel. Would you come from Florida to Brookfield, Connecticut and help me out? So Alan Bono said, yes, I'll do that for you. So at this time, on February 16th, Alan Bono was in Brookfield for around 6 months. So basically, according to Wanda Johnson, Arne Johnson's sister's account, what happened was they all went to visit Debbie Glatzel at the boarding kennel. And then Alan Bono decided to take all of them to lunch, which was quite a nice gesture. So they all went to lunch. And apparently at lunch, Alan Bono had a few too many glasses of red wine. Apparently Arne Johnson and his girlfriend, Debbie Glatzel, maybe have partaken in some drinking, but not to the level of Alan Bono, which they've described as he was quite intoxicated, a bit drunk. And that was sort of the lunch meeting.
But Arne was 19 at this time. So was he underage
Supposedly,
drinking?
Probably yes, because in America, legal age is 21 to drink. So the local bar that he took them for lunch was called Mug and Munch. So they went to eat there. And as I've said, everyone had a bit of wine. Alan Bono, maybe a bit too much wine. So after lunch, they returned to the kennels where Alan Bono was the manager and Debbie worked. So they returned to the kennels, and then nothing really happened during that afternoon. They came back from lunch. And then Debbie decided to bring Arne Johnson's sisters to go for pizza. So they went for pizza. And at the time, Arne stayed behind and fixed Alan Bono's stereo. Alan Bono turned on the stereo really loudly, and Alan was sort of taking the day to himself, a little bit drunk, and Debbie and the younger sisters were at the pizza joint. When they returned, actually, well, let me backtrack. So Debbie had a weird inkling, a little feeling inside, thinking, actually, we should get back to the kennel. Something's not right. I don't sense something's right. Despite us having pizza, let's just quickly go back to the kennel and see
like a sixth sense.
Yeah, see what the men are doing. So they returned to the kennels. So as they returned, Alan Bono took them all upstairs in the kennel. There's apparently another floor in the kennel. And he basically turned the TV on really loud. And everyone was upstairs except Arne Johnson, who was downstairs. So Debbie, Arnie's sisters, and the cousin Mary was upstairs, and Alan Bono was upstairs, and he turned the TV on really loud. And at this point, he was still a bit intoxicated from all the red wine he was drinking at the Mug and Munch lunch spot. So at this point, Alan Bono was apparently displaying aggression and violent behavior. For example, he was punching his fist really heavily. Apparently, he was punching the walls, and he actually put a hole into the wall. Why? And basically displaying weird...
Oh, okay.
Drunken, aggressive behavior. So Debbie, of course, was like, okay, we're out. I don't want him to hurt me or hurt the young siblings of my boyfriend. So she basically said, okay, kids, let's go downstairs. Let's kind of leave him in the upstairs, area, and let's just leave. At that time, Alan Bono was clearly intoxicated, didn't allow them to leave. So he basically grabbed cousin Mary, the youngest, and grabbed him by the hand and said, you're not going downstairs. So she's obviously like, let me go. Arne at this time kind of heard the commotion, was like, okay, what's going on? So he ran back upstairs, saw the commotion. Arne places his hand on Alan's shoulder and said, hey, let go of her. We just want to go downstairs, be kind of like the more gentle approach. Whereas Debbie was like, okay, no, get off her. And Debbie sort of grabbed...
Kind of like the mama bear.
Yeah, grabbed Mary off him, and then basically the kids were so scared they ran downstairs. So at this time, it was reported that Alan Bono said an obscene remark regarding Arnie's siblings. So that's kind of the reported thing. So whatever remark it is, or whatever conversation happened, Arne and Alan basically went downstairs to scuffle and kind of get into a fist fight. So as they went downstairs, Alan started taunting Arne, punching his fist into his palm like this and say, come fight me, come fight me. And Arne was just standing there staring at him. Didn't do anything at first. Arne at one point backed off, and Alan kept saying, come fight me, come at me, bro, essentially, come fight me. And at this point, Wanda Johnson, his sisters, basically said that at this point she kind of saw something that broke in him. And she basically said that she tried to hold on to Arne, grab him, and he wouldn't move. He was like set in stone. He just would not move. And she just could not budge him. And then from Debbie Glatzel's account, and also Wanda's account, the sister Wanda, they both mentioned that Arne started growling, like animalistic growling. Like, ugh. To Debbie, Arne actually started contorting his face. And this is important because I didn't go into the kind of the background of this. So you have Alan Bono, drunken 40-year-old, just being leery and aggressive, kind of fight me. And you have Arne, initially, the hand on the shoulder, please let my sister go, to the backing off, just standing quite still. He switched, apparently something broke in him, as his sister said, and he started growling, animalistic, contorting his face into a hatred-like kind of look.
So basically from 0 to 100.
100 to 100,
he was
right.
calm, and then all of a sudden he was like...
Yes.
A demon.
Well, we'll get to the demon part later, but he was sort of growling. And then Wanda's account and Debbie's account, even to the trial, they did not admit or even state that they saw the actual stabbing occur. Wanda Johnson did say she saw a shiny thing flash. And that shiny flash actually was a pocket knife, a 5-inch pocket knife that Arne would carry around, maybe for his tree surgeon job, but he carried it around. And all she saw was a flashing, except her and Debbie Glatzel never saw any actual stabbing. And what really occurred was on Alan Bono's body, he was found lying there. He had 5 stab wounds, one severe one from his abdomen all the way up to his heart. 4 stab wounds in his chest, abdomen area, and one in his shoulder. Now, at this point, obviously, Alan could not witness the stabbing. Arne is, to this day, pleads that he did not do anything, and the sisters did not see anything. All the sisters saw was a shiny flash. What happened after the flash and Alan Bono lying there? Arne decided to go for a long, long walk. So actually, the police found him on a long road walking by himself.
So that report allegedly stabs the guy.
Yes, so,
and then he sees him and then he goes for a walk.
Right. So
was he just like
Well, no. Well, basically, Alan Bono, there's a flash of the shiny object. Alan Bono fell.
Right.
And then Arne Johnson left the scene and decided to go on a walk. He left the knife there and he basically decided to go on a very long walk.
And his girlfriend and siblings.
Yeah, so they were left there and he basically went on a long walk. So the police actually went and try to locate him, and they found him walking disoriented, not with himself, walking down this long road. So when they took him in to the police station, he basically said that he did not recall anything that happened from essentially the time of the stabbing, which was around shortly after 6. Had no recollection, basically did not know what happened, did not think that he stabbed Alan, did not really remember the altercation, him growling, none of that. So that's kind of what happened. So you might be thinking this kind of sounds like a straightforward, maybe a self-defense, provocation. His sister's been held by him. He's trying to taunting him. But that's not exactly why there was a media frenzy over this case. So the media frenzy about this case was because Marin Manella, the lawyer for Arne Johnson, who actually took the case pro bono, he wanted to plead defense by possession of demonic possession. So you wanted to say he did not know what he was doing. He had no autonomy to kill anyone because he was possessed by the devil when this happened.
Right.
So because he made this claim, which was in the newspapers, this caused media frenzy. And this was in the 80s. So I'm not sure if you're aware of the Satanic Panic, which is probably another episode. But Satanic Panic was a big thing in America where most things that were done were blamed on the devil. Peculiar behaviors of teenagers were blamed on the devil. So this was sort of happened in like 1981. So this is sort of the start of Satanic Panic. So
right, but
caused a media frenzy.
But if he started pleading demonic possession, is there a legal definition for demonic possession?
So we'll get into that, but we need to kind of explain why demonic possession, because you're probably thinking, why is there demonic possession even mentioned? Because besides the growling in the face, being angry, that could happen to most people. Why is that demonic possession, right? So to go into the background of this demonic possession, it's actually quite a long case, and actually involves not Arne Johnson per se. It involves Debbie Glatzel, his girlfriend's brother, David Glatzel.
Oh my gosh, this web is getting big.
And it might sound familiar to you because this case was actually written to a book, and Ed and Lorraine Warren, the self-professed demonologists and also the paranormal investigators, who are also the subjects of the series The Conjuring by James Wan. The whole Conjuring universe is based on Ed and Lorraine Warren's cases. There's Annabelle the doll, Amityville Horror, and actually Arne Johnson's case, which, if I believe, I think the second or third movie, they do go into David Glatzel, the boy was possessed. It's actually, I think it's called The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. It's actually based on David Glatzel.
Yeah, I did watch it.
Yes.
Yeah, I got really scared about, I did. It's a good movie.
Just to preface the book, some of the family members are upset about the book, basically saying that the Lorraine family exploited them, wrote a book about it by Gerald Brittle, which is the book that I've used to kind of gather my information. The Devil in Connecticut was the book that was on the demonic possession of David Glatzel, the brother. So I know that his brother Carl was completely against the book, also against the whole idea that his brother was possessed by the demon or the devil. So with that said, I'm kind of going to go into the demonic possession situation. So basically the Glatzel family, let me kind of describe who was in the Glatzel family. So you had Carl and Judy Glatzel, the mother and the father, and they had Debbie, their daughter, was 26 at the time. And you had Carl Jr., who was the person who was kind of contesting the book and the contents and the demonic possession. And you had Alan, and you had David. So these were sort of the people involved. And Debbie didn't live at home because she was a little bit older, 26. She had a son of her own, and she lived with her boyfriend, Arne Johnson. So Arne and Debbie didn't really like where they lived, and they basically approached Debbie Glatzel's parents and said, I'm going to move out to meet the north of Connecticut. We kind of want to be out of the city. We want to have a nice little house so we can live in. And at the time, Arne Johnson was living with his mother and his siblings, his sisters, and they all decided to kind of uproot and live outside the city. So Arne...
All of them? The whole family?
Well, Arne, his sisters, and then Debbie. So them, the small unit. I believe the father was out of the picture. So they decided to find a place up north in Connecticut to live there out of the city. So Arne and Debbie found a really nice house up north. And they're like, okay, it's a perfect house. It's beautiful. Let's sign a lease to rent the place. So they basically all decided to go there on the move-in day and sort of get everything ready. And Debbie's mother also was there with her brothers, Carl, Alan, and David. So they're all there to kind of help with the house. And the house was in disarray. The painting wasn't that great. There's a grass that was overgrown. And basically, Debbie's mother sent the boys to go and fix the house. So they basically tasked David, the youngest, to go and check all the cupboards and throw out all the trash or the junk out of the cupboards. So there was a far room in this house. And this far room had a waterbed, which I've never been on.
Ew.
I know. They had a waterbed, and for some reason this waterbed has been mentioned several times in this book, for whatever reason. I think waterbeds were quite a hot commodity in the 80s, I think,
but also it's kind of like displaced because it's like a house in disarray and then suddenly you have like...
Well, the waterbed was left by the previous tenants. But either way, David was in this far room tasked with cleaning up the cupboards, and he sees this waterbed and he's like, I don't know, something's not right with waterbed. I don't want to jump on it. So apparently, according to David, he suddenly felt two large grown man hands push his belly onto the waterbed. So he's now lying flat on the waterbed being pushed. So he gets up and looks like, who just pushed me? And apparently he sees this old man with white hair, white mustache, kind of a plaid shirt and jeans, and he was see-through. And this old man basically raised his hand and was like, beware, said the words beware. And then David was freaked out and basically ran out of the house. And then he basically recounts this to his sister Debbie and Arne. And they're like, oh, this is horrible. Like, this is scary, right? So being a good sister as she is, she basically says, well, let's not move in because it's haunted. So she goes and tells her mom, and she says, hey, Mom, Judy, there's a haunting there. We probably should move in. The mom was dismissive and said, no, this is a nice house. We're just going to move in. So me and your sister's going to move in, but you and Arne, your boyfriend, can do whatever you want. So that's what they did. So Debbie and Arne moved out, basically.
No, thank you.
Yes. So that's kind of what happened with this house. So to kind of understand or backtrack, the house was going to be lived in by Arne Johnson's mother and his sisters, whereas the Glatzels had their own house. But on that day, the Glatzel mother... The mom basically was kind enough to say, I'm going to come and help you, and I'll bring the boys. And the boys came and they saw this, or at least David saw this, and basically went back home to their house.
Right. Okay.
So now you have two houses involved.
Two houses.
And then now a third house when Arne lives with Debbie. They live in a separate place.
Okay, right. So 3 separate houses. Right. One's a new one. One is the Glatzels, and one is the boyfriend-girlfriend.
Yes.
Okay.
So after David told Debbie, and Debbie was like, okay, well, I'm not staying there, but I'm going to move somewhere else. David went home. And apparently, according to his accounts, or according to the book, the entity, the man, the see-through man, actually followed him back to the Glatzel house. So there's an account where he was detailing how he was flying through the state, and basically, I know, it ended up in the house.
What do you mean, the entity was flying through?
Yeah, basically,
following him?
David could, track him as he was following him. So eventually, he ended up in the house.
Did he not say, yo, this thing is following me?
But no one would listen to him at this point, because he just encountered this thing in the far room with the waterbed, And apparently when he went home, he could just somehow GPS this entity following him.
Yo, that's
basically what happened.
So he felt or saw that the entity...
He felt, heard, because apparently this entity started talking to him. Right. So a bunch of weird things happened when he got back home, right? So he basically said that this entity would talk to him. He still saw the see-through man in the day, but at night, the see-through man would turn red and had horns and a tail. Obviously like the devil, right? And he'll basically say this man would punish him and say, if you don't do X, Y, and Z, right, I'm going to end up punishing you. And one of the things that he wanted David to do was remove all the crucifixes from that house with the waterbed. So remove the crucifixes or I'll punish you. There are instances where David will be basically hit like this to kind of indicate that he was being punched and slapped by the devil. So the family actually witnessed him jerking around, being contorting, because he would claim that the devil or the entity was punching him and slapping him. And apparently Debbie, to her, she actually saw a belt levitate off the closet. So from David just kind of saying he saw something to actually David supposedly having physical manifestations of being hurt to Debbie seeing this belt fly up, they decided to go to Father Dennis, one of their, the local priests, to kind of bless the house. And, he gave, at the time, Father Dennis gave them some blessed holy candles. He placed it around the house. That worked for a while, and then David started being kind of abused by this entity. Also, the entity would speak through him as an intermediary, so would obviously say things that he wouldn't know as I believe, 9-year-old child at that point. He would say, call profanities to his mom and his sister, would call them just derogatory, misogynistic names.
Right.
Just horrible things, say things that would be beyond him. Apparently he would tell the demon through him, would say a past life that he lived, or mention relatives that he wouldn't have known at his age.
Oh, really?
Right. So all these weird things the family were kind of getting, now they've increasingly become more, they believe him more, the Glatzel family at least. Yeah. And at this time, Carl Glatzel, the father, wasn't really, sort of kind of believing it, but not really. So,
yeah, because in the movie, the dad was just like, nah, this is all like...
I mean, it's always the dad.
Everything was happening,
yes,
and the dad was just like...
For some reason...
It is what it is.
The dad never believes you for some reason.
For some reason, yeah.
Why the Warrens got involved, basically, they try to do kind of like blessings in the house, as I mentioned, the holy candles. Obviously, it wasn't working. They were like, okay, we need some legit exorcism thing going on.
But where's Father Dennis at this point? Was he just like, peace out, I'm done?
Well, no, there was
a bit of holy water.
They were still involved because the family would go to church and go to mass. So like, all in all, there were sort of 4 priests that helped out, but they weren't of the level or caliber of, let's say, a priest that practiced exorcism and actually faced the devil, right? So that's what they need. The level of exorcism they needed was top notch, essentially.
Well, you need permission from like, I don't
exactly.
know.
Exactly. Well, they needed the permission from the diocese to actually do this. So when they sought the permission, they were told, actually, it might take a while to get permission, by the way. You may or may not get it, but it's going to take a while. So why don't I recommend this couple that we are aware of, also are based in Connecticut. They're Ed and Lorraine Warren. They can maybe help you or maybe understand the situation. So Ed and Lorraine Warren visited the house, interviewed the boy, got a lot of tape recordings of the boy being supposedly either in demonic possession when he was in a normal state.
They played it in the movie, like the actual recordings.
Yeah, they had recordings of the boy. And Lorraine was sort of transfixed on why this was happening to the family. And they're basically tracing back to like why each individual was susceptible to the devil. So as I mentioned, Debbie saw the belt levitate, and they basically traced it back to Debbie's obsession with the occult. So apparently, as a school project, Debbie actually was obsessed or dabbled in the Ouija board.
Right.
And she was, this is so interesting, the Ouija board, I'm going to play with it. And apparently she did play with it, I believe with herself or with a friend. And she basically said that the Ouija board predicted the weight of her son, the gender of her son, and was really accurate. And what Lorraine Warren said was dabbling in this Ouija board basically opened your instrument up to being susceptible to the entity being attached to. So therefore, maybe why she saw the belt levitate, why she witnessed her brother go through all these things. We're more susceptible to, more sensitive.
You open something basically, right? Yeah.
Lorraine Warren also said that obviously because you and Arne are living as husband and wife and not married, that could be a thing too. So the Warren family were very heavily influenced by God and was a little bit traditional in their thinking. So there was one incident that would sort of explain why Arne Johnson is now related. So there's a little backstory about the David in the house. So now how is Arne related, right? So Arne Johnson was the boyfriend of Debbie, and Debbie's brother, David, was the one possessed.
Right.
So as a good boyfriend as he was at the time, he obviously was involved in this, trying to help David. And he basically witnessed all the episodes of David contorting, being, hit around the head, and his stomach being, So he was there to support David and help him, and like putting holy water on him, putting the candles everywhere. And there have been some instances during David's bad episodes where he would really react, being really affected by this entity, that Arne would say, leave him alone, he's a boy, he's not strong enough, enter me, please take me, the devil should take me. I don't want
nice.
Yeah, I don't want him to take my girlfriend's brother. So that's what he kept saying, and put holy water, holding the boy down, and then telling the entity, please possess me, essentially. So that's what the Warrens believed that has happened. So there have been some kind of mini exorcisms, and they really got the permission to have the really major exorcism from the priest, from a really high rank priest that has dealt with the devil. So at this point, the exorcisms were kind of low level. Some worked, some didn't. And David at this point claimed he was possessed by 43 demons, actually, entities, and he would recognize each entity of doing certain things. So if something went wrong in the house, this is the entity that did this. He would basically account for each thing going crazy in the house to an entity tied to it.
But could it not be just him doing really bad things and then blaming like the imaginary man who did it?
Yes, that could be another school of thought. So yes, as I mentioned, Arne would tell the entity to enter him, right? Supposedly from Debbie's account, there have been strange occurrences happening in Arne himself.
Since he said, take me.
Yes, yeah. Maybe not immediately after, but apparently Arne would have weird convulsions. There was kind of 6 episodes of possession of Arne.
Right.
So apparently he would convulse. He would just be in a trance. And apparently Debbie was saying that the entity, through speaking through David, would say to Arne, I'm going to possess you, and you're going to kill someone with a knife, and you're going to be on the hook. You're going to be guilty of this crime. You're going to commit a crime. This is what David said. The entity said that through David. So
right, and this was before
before this Alan Bono's stabbing. So Debbie believes that it was a premonition of what happened. So all the possessions happened, and essentially at one point they believe that the situation with David stopped. I believe there's one of the last exorcisms performed. Maybe not the big grand exorcism, but supposedly they claim that the entity left David.
Right.
And apparently they said, okay, well, now it's all done. I believe this was in around October time, about 6 months before the stabbing, essentially, what happened. So they said that David has now been free of this entity. 6 months later, the stabbing happened. So 6 months later, Arne was supposedly possessed and stabbed Bono. The Warrens basically came out after Arne was arrested and said, actually, David, the entity was never properly excised, never was properly dealt with. It all just exited David, but it was never,
contained.
Exactly. Yeah. It was still running around and basically possessed Arne. And its last act of cruelty and horrible thing that the entity could do was possess Arne and kill Alan Bono. So that's what the Warrens were claiming. And they basically said that Arne was possessed at the time. This thing is still running around, this entity. And he shouldn't be tried for a crime that he didn't commit because he was possessed at the time, right? So I've mentioned to you at the time, Wanda Johnson and Debbie Glatzel, Wanda being his sister, witnessed him growling and face contorting. So to link that back to David's possession, David also displayed growling, animalistic growling, and would contort his face to like animalistic hatred, just pure hatred. And that was sort of the look and the growling that was mimicked in Arne. So because of that, Debbie at the time knew that, in her mind, knew that Arne was possessed because he displayed those qualities that David had.
Yeah. She recognized it.
Yes.
Yeah.
So now back to the legal case. So now would that kind of explain the demonic possession? So Arnie's lawyer basically said that he didn't want to plead an insanity defense. Because insanity, you could have maybe said, he was suffering from delusions, maybe a mental disorder that would cause him to think he's possessed by a devil. He said it's not that at all. It's completely separate. It was actually demonic possession. And at the time, he wanted to in the newspaper articles, it was reported that before Arne would enter a plea of not guilty or not guilty, he would basically put forward this defense of demonic possession. And in the newspapers, he was reported to say, the lawyer, that he would get all the tape recordings, he would try to subpoena the priests, and they didn't want to come to testify, just to show that demonic possession did occur in David, and by David, by proxy, it went to Arne because of his involvement in the exorcisms, saying the devil should enter him. So the lawyer was saying, I'm going to subpoena all these priests. And he also basically sought counsel of 2 cases in England, actually, and 2 cases that involved demonic possession, although it didn't go to a jury trial, and those cases were criticized. He basically wanted to rely on those cases as some sort of precedent, because at this time, America did not have any precedent on demonic possession. Yeah. Right, so when it came to entering a plea, Arne Johnson pled not guilty because he still maintains to this day that he did not know what happened essentially after 6 o'clock when the stabbing occurred, right? Did not know what happened, and if something did happen, he may be demonically possessed. So he's pleading not guilty. He didn't do it. The judge at this time sort of questioned the lawyer and said, okay, well, what's your defense? It kind of had an inkling because there's this media frenzy, right? Because his lawyer's been talking to the press. I'm sure the judge by this time would know demonic possession was a thing. So he said, well, are you going to plead as a defense? And he goes, yes, I will. And the judge essentially threw it out and said, well, there's no scientific or objective, there's no findings on demonic possession. Like, this is not a defense, it's not recognized, and I'm not going to entertain this, and it's going to be thrown out. So what essentially the lawyer did was they kind of changed tactics, and they kind of went for a defense of self-defense, which what we mentioned earlier with the sister being grabbed by Alan Bono, wouldn't let go, and basically Alan Bono taunting him, fight me. And basically they were pushing that as a defense rather than he was possessed. And because of that, he was guilty of manslaughter. He was actually released on good behavior early, actually. So on December 18th, 1981, he was sentenced to a maximum of 10 to 20 years in prison, but he actually was only served 4 years for good behavior. So kind of, people like to talk about this case, but all in all, it's quite a straightforward case. If you take out the demonic possession that I've talked about, really is a case about provocation. Well, Alan Bono taunting him, saying all these, allegedly saying horrible remarks about his sisters, and this altercation happened and his death occurred. This demonic possession was sort of an added element to the case, which actually wasn't even considered in the court because the judge threw it out. And why this case was so famous and popular to this day was because of the side story of this demonic possession of David Glatzel. And you might be wondering, well, because I'm surely this case set a precedent of demonic possession. Clearly, people shouldn't plead this if it's not going to ever be in court. But surprisingly, there's quite a few cases, even to this day, where people have attempted to plead demonic possession in some capacity. There's a case in the States, and basically the accused tried to appeal his conviction by saying, he was denied expert witness fees for a person speaking on demonic possession, which he believed he was. And the court said this is not, you can't prove demonic possession would help your case, and this expert witness, it's not scientific, it's not going to work. So in that respect, there's demonic possession. People have tried to plead it as part of a insanity defense. Obviously, if you're thinking of these kind of delusions, that might be a good defense for you. So there was a recent case, and it's Jan G versus State. And surprisingly, it was in Connecticut, which was actually...
What is going on in Connecticut?
I don't know.
Literally. Isn't Amityville Horror in Connecticut too?
I think it might be.
Right.
Because the Warren family were from Connecticut, and most of the cases happened there.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so there's a recent case in Connecticut, actually. Jan G versus the State. It was appealed, and then it's actually went on to Jan G versus the Commission of Corrections. And the Commission of Corrections is kind of a legal body that oversees unwrongful imprisonment and basically oversees the process, basically what it does. So he basically petitioned and said, I want to reverse my murder conviction because I wasn't offered the opportunity to plead my objective. I was forced to plead guilty when I'm pleading not guilty by demonic possession. This is my objective. The law should favor my defense rather than the lawyer thinking of what defense is best for me, which is actually what happened. The lawyer thought the best defense was actually a defense of extreme emotional disturbance, which would cause the murder. So the lawyer pled that instead of not guilty for him, which was not guilty by demonic possession, because the lawyer didn't think demonic possession is not going to be upheld. We know from Connecticut, the case of Arne Johnson, that's not going to be upheld. So the lawyer made that decision. So what happened in that case was basically the defendant lived in this 2-floor apartment with his elderly parents.
And this is recent?
Recent, yeah, a few years ago. But it's actually the conclusion of this commissioner overview was that it had to be a retrial. So what happened in this case was the defendant lived on the first floor. His elderly parents lived on the floor above. And in the night of question, he consumed a lot of cocaine, copious amounts of cocaine. This was on October 13, 2011. And when he basically consumed all the cocaine, he went upstairs to his parents' room. So his mom was about 74 years old. His father was 90. Went up to the second floor, basically punched his elderly mother in the jaw, and basically knocked out a few of her teeth, and they cut her upper lip, and she was like disoriented. They punched his mother. And then at that time, after he punched his mother, he went back to his apartment downstairs, and he basically got an ornamental sword. He basically came up with his sword and basically decided to attack his dad, his father, his 9-year-old father. And basically what happened was he broke his father's nose, slit his throat about twice, and gouged his left eye out. He basically got the thing and gouged his eye out. And basically the crazy thing what he did was he amputated his dad's penis and he ate it.
What?
So he must have been in such a...
Are you sure he was doing cocaine?
Yes.
Just
well,
cocaine?
To him, he was possessed by the
right.
by the devil.
By the cocaine demon.
Yeah, the cocaine demon, yes. So when the police found him, he was basically naked, like half naked from like the waist down, and he was on his computer and he's bloody. And one of the first things he said to the police was, I am Satan. I can actually read it to you here. He says, I am Satan. I made a pact with your earth and you did not keep your end of the deal. I order you to release me and take these cuffs off me. So that's what he said. He kept on maintaining that he was Satan. Although later on in the police department, when he was brought to the police station, he basically said that he confessed that it was drugs and crack and cocaine. And he also asked, how long do you think this will grant me in prison? 10, 20 years? So he did say that despite him saying he's Satan, right? So basically, it was revealed through the mother that he actually had a history of cocaine abuse and drug abuse. And at the time, he had an attorney assigned to him, attorney Isco, and he kind of reviewed the situation. He maybe have entertained, okay, maybe demonic possession, could it work? He did his research, okay, since Arne Johnson, have there been demonic possession successfully pled in court? Because this guy is clearly claiming satanic possession. Couldn't find anything, obviously. And then in his opinion, he got 2 psychiatric evaluations. One that basically didn't support the case really, and the psychiatric basically said that he didn't necessarily find psychotic illness, which probably wouldn't help the mental defect case of insanity, right? And the other case, other evaluation was from a Dr. Buchanan, and he believes that in the attorney's mind, from looking at Dr. Buchanan's evaluation, he thought that this would support the defense of extreme emotional distress rather than mental defect. So it's 2 different things, right? So, I mean, at the end of the case, well, this review, essentially, it was held that he should have pled mental defect because the Dr. Buchanan's report did support mental defect, not necessarily extreme emotional disturbance, which wasn't as extreme as mental defect, right? So, Jan G was obviously very upset that the attorney decided to go for extreme emotional disturbance and not even the fact that he was possessed by the devil, right?
Because he truly believes he was possessed.
He truly believed he was possessed. So he basically wrote to the Judge Solomon, and said, hey, I don't want to pursue this emotional disturbance defense. This is not, I don't want this. I want to basically push forward the defense of demonic possession. So he wrote it to the judge, and the judge received it. And what the judge said was, you know, I received this, but it's in your lawyer's jurisdiction to make this claim in your best interest. The lawyer makes a decision, which generally speaking, as an attorney, you're supposed to fight for the best interest of your client. That doesn't mean necessarily following by word what they want, right? It's in their best interest. So in his attorney Isco's mind, based on Dr. Buchanan's review, his report mostly supports emotional disturbance and not mental defect, and also he wouldn't think demonic possession would be successful.
No. Yeah.
So he basically went against what the client wanted, right? Kind of to sidetrack, when this whole Jan G versus state happening and through the appeals, there's also sort of a parallel case going on in Louisiana. And this case was the case of McCoy. And what happened was the defendant was kind of convicted of murder.
Right.
And he basically maintained that he was not guilty, he didn't do anything. But the attorney felt at the time that had he pled guilty, he would receive more leniency in the sentencing. Whatever that thought process was, I don't understand. But he thought to go against his client's wishes. So the client actually appealed, and he actually won and got his conviction reversed, because the court held that the Sixth Amendment would protect people in criminal trials. It was actually held that it was correct. He was correct. The Sixth Amendment right was infringed, and the Sixth Amendment right in America essentially means that the defendant in a criminal trial is entitled to a speedy trial, which means it should be an expedited or expedient trial, shouldn't drag it on for a while, and the defendant has a right to know all the facts of the case. And they also extended, not exactly extended, but they sort of clarified Sixth Amendment in the McCoy case and said the client has the right to control or dictate the objective of his case. Mm-hmm. And then the objective of McCoy's case was that he was not guilty. Mm. So that was his objective. And the lawyer went against his objective and made him plead not guilty.
Right.
So this was kind of a parallel case. And
no, made him plead guilty or not guilty?
Made him plead, the attorney made him plead guilty where he's not guilty. Okay. Yes. Yes. So this was a parallel case to the Jan G case, right, versus the state. So because this was going on, and it actually concluded when about that case was convicted, and he was like, charged for murder.
So basically he was able to use that
Yes, he was going to use,
yeah.
So in the review of this commissioner's situation, Commissioner of Corrections, he basically was kind of questioning, can I use this case? Would it apply to me because of the timing lapse? And it was held that it would apply, the commissioner held it would apply. And basically held that the fact that it was demonic possession was a red herring, and basically said that because regardless of whether or not he was possessed by the demon or not, or the devil, he maintained that he did not do it. He was not guilty. Mm-hmm. So that by itself should be pled instead of guilty by emotional disturbance, because part of, the defense of, let's say, even manslaughter or emotional disturbance, you had to plead, essentially be found guilty first to have that as a defense, right? So basically, even in that trial in the Jan G versus state, the judge instructed, okay, well, if you found him beyond reasonable doubt guilty of murder, please consider this defense of emotional disturbance. So by that would mean Jan G was held guilty, which is completely what he didn't want. So the commissioner basically held that in this situation, his objective was to plead not guilty. Demon possession was a red herring, and the attorney should have pursued not guilty and have the court essentially.
So basically, it was like a technicality rather than you can plead demonic possession. It's much rather, no, you must plead not guilty regardless of what he says.
Exactly,
right? And that's up to you as the attorney to figure out why he's not guilty.
Yeah, or have the prosecution prove, because usually the burden's on the prosecution to prove, right?
Yeah.
So it's now in a retrial. This case is sort of kind of ongoing, and I'm curious to see where it goes. But it's kind of interesting to see if your client is claiming he's possessed by demonic possession or by the devil. I guess the first instinct is not necessarily to just discredit that or to ignore that, because by the Sixth Amendment, as has been ruled in McCoy, you have to kind of understand what the objective of the client's goal is, right?
Regardless of what he's saying what happened.
Because if he's possessed by the devil, it could be a red herring. It could be like, okay, well, you could be possessed, but ultimately, do you believe you committed it? If you're not guilty, you're not guilty.
Right.
Whether or not the client wants to plead demonic possession as in his testimony and trial, that's his doing, right? Mm-hmm. But you shouldn't, because demonic possession, sidetrack and say, okay, actually, let's just plead guilty because that's going to help
the client.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So that's kind of ongoing, but that's kind of to roundabout say that there have been demonic possession pled in America to this day. And it's interesting to see how the judge interprets it. But to this day, there's no precedent.
Yeah,
you
it hasn't
plead.
been successful.
No, it has not been successful.
Right. So do you think that would there be any cases where it would be successful? I mean, I guess the burden, like the burden of proving it is huge, right? Because it has to be based on something that's concrete, and this is not based on something that's concrete. I mean, depends on who you ask, really, right?
I mean, to kind of recite what Judge Solomon said in the case of Arne Johnson, he basically said there was no scientific basis or objective basis, right? So, I mean, if there is a day where you can prove possession somehow, I guess it could be upheld, but there's no study of it. Like demonology is not necessarily a recognized degree either, right? So, I mean, I don't know. We'll see. I mean, like,
because surely then you'd have to have a legal definition for it just opens just a bag of like what ifs and what can be.
Right. It has to be proven first.
Yes. Maybe. Yeah. Technology is advancing every day.
But then how do you know it's not faked technology? That's the thing.
The universe is big. The universe is very big. So we don't know half of what's out there or what can be proved. So could be.
Yeah, that's true. That concludes the case of demonic possession. There are also several interesting things in America, which I haven't gone into. There's great cases in Louisiana where they talk about haunted houses and the duty to disclose is a haunted house. So there's a whole animal of... America has such rich cases involving the occult, demon possession, the devil, and it's so interesting and fascinating. But today we conclude with this case. If you liked today's video, please like, subscribe, and share.